Good evening, everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started with this program on feathers, the feather exploration. Hopefully, you're in the right spot. So, my name is Julie Watson, and I am the Wildlife Education Coordinator and Volunteer Coordinator for the Nevada Department of Wildlife. I work out of our headquarters here in very snowy today, Reno, Nevada, and I am joined by Jessica Brooks. She is our Wildlife Education Coordinator down in Las Vegas, and she's going to be helping out in the chat box and with any questions that arise. And we also will have Amanda Perez. So you might see her name. She's a volunteer with us. She's going to help answer questions too. So you might see those names in the chat. Please trust them. But we are going to spend the next 45 minutes to an hour exploring feathers, what they're made of, what animals have feathers, where they come from, what purpose they serve. That is what we're going to be learning about. So we're going to do a deep dive into feathers as unique appendages that animals have adapted to serve many different purposes. So before we get started, we're going to do some housekeeping. First and most importantly, you are all muted. We cannot see you. You can be as comfortable as you want. We will not hear your dog barking. We can't hear or see you. So that is why it is important to engage with us. We have a couple different features. The one that we're going to use the most is the chat feature. And at the bottom of your screen, you should see an icon that looks like this. And when you click on it, you'll see something that looks kind of like this. We want you to make sure that you are sending messages to all panelists and attendees. So if you click where it says all panelists and there's a little down arrow, that should give you options to send to all panelists and attendees, because we want everyone to be able to see what you're saying, including us. So that's the chat box. We also have the Q&A box. It will look similarly. It also has an icon at the bottom of your screen, and it'll say Q&A, and you can type in questions there. That's a good place to ask questions. And Amanda or Jess will answer it, or they'll prompt myself to answer it live if a lot of you are answering the same question. So please feel free to use those features as this program continues. But we do ask that you keep it PG in the chat and in the Q&A. This is a family program. We want to make sure that profanity or any inappropriate behavior, if you're getting off topic in any of these spaces, otherwise we will have to remove you from the webinar. In addition, if you have any technical difficulties, you can message Jess or Amanda and they can help you out. Hopefully that doesn't happen, but just in case. So that is some of our housekeeping. And just to let you know, we are recording this. So if you have to leave early or you miss some of it, this will end up on our YouTube in a couple weeks. So, and at the end of the program, we have a survey that will automatically pop up for you. And we really welcome any type of feedback. There are, it's multiple choice, but then there's also a comment section. If there's something that you liked, didn't like, or if there's topics that you want to see us present in the future, that is a good place to put that. So please, at the end of this, fill that survey out, help us out so that we can bring programs that you want to see to you. So, sorry about that. I probably just ruined this first question, but let's get the ball rolling. So what animals have feathers? So go ahead and use that chat option. And I want you to list all the animals that you know of that have feathers. Don't be shy. Use that chat box. all birds? Any other animals? Is it just birds? So this is kind of a trick question, but it's birds, and it's only birds. Only birds have feathers. No other animal, no other type of animal has feathers. If you see an animal that has feathers, or if you find a feather, it can only have come from a bird. And to me, that was just a revelation. It's something that you know, but you don't know until you know. It kind of blew my mind. Um, I've shared this revelation with students before, and without fail, they all answer, well, what about ducks? What about penguins? Well, a reminder, those are also all birds. But feathers are incredibly unique, and we're going to explore how feathers have changed over time, as well as a lot of the purposes that they serve. So we are going to go back in time. We're going to start at the very beginning. Where did feathers come from? And this is a fun thing to talk about. Feathers, and this is recent. So if you are at all informed with the scientific community, you know that this is something recent. We knew that dinosaurs were the precursor to birds from the fossil record, and for a very, very long time, there was only one dinosaur that could be linked to birds, and it was Archaeopteryx, which is a feathered and winged bird with teeth and a bony tail. They're really cool. You've probably heard about them before. But new discoveries in the fossil record have linked that birds came from dinosaurs. And these dinosaurs are a group called theropods. And our fan favorite dinosaur, the T-Rex here, is a theropod. So birds are considered by paleontologists to be avian dinosaurs. So not only did they come from dinosaurs, but they are dinosaurs. They're avian dinosaurs, which is so cool. Birds are dinosaurs. There's also non-avian dinosaurs. They are called sauropods, and good examples of those are long-necked, four-legged dinosaurs like the Apatosaurus, which you might also know as the Brontosaurus. And so moving on, this is Archaeopteryx, which I mentioned. So this is the avian dinosaur fossil that was discovered a long time ago and kind of made that first connection to birds and dinosaurs. And it was one of the first birds because its fossils had preserved feathers. And they do think that Archaeopteryx was able to fly. It did have flight. And we know that dinosaurs have been capable of feathers for a long time, but unfortunately, feathers do not preserve in fossils very easily. So it wasn't until recently in the 1990s when non-avian dinosaur fossils were found to have evidence of feathers. So feathers came before birds, which I think is really interesting because if they're the only animal alive that has feathers, it's amazing that these feathers evolved way before birds came along. So feathers and dinosaurs, birds are dinosaurs, we're moving right along. So the first feathers that were found on these non-avian dinosaurs did not look like what we think of today. So they were not highly developed feathers like we would find, and they're not like the feathers that were found on Archaeopteryx either, because those were very specialized flight feathers. These were more hollow quill-like proto feathers, and so they were just very simple structure. And you can see in this rendering of this Tyrannosaurus Rex that it looks more furry. And that is where it gets the term dino fuzz. They think these feathers served as a form of insulation, which we will get to the purpose of feathers in just a little bit. But scientists believe right now that feather evolution started with these dino feather proto feathers. And then as time went on, they got more branched and more complicated like these flight feathers. Now we're talking a lot about some very new science. And I just want to give a disclaimer that although we've learned a lot about birds and dinosaurs and feathers, they're all new discoveries. It's super exciting. But the cool thing about science is that when we get new information, these hypotheses change. So what I'm talking about today, we might have new evidence to where maybe some of these ideas that we have today are different in the future. So I do just want to give that disclaimer when we're talking about such new discoveries, which is also still super cool. So we talked about dino fuzz. How did they know that dino fuzz are feathers and not just fur? So we know this because these protofeathers and all feathers are made up of a very special protein called beta keratin. And fur, which I'm going to talk about next, is not made out of beta keratin. So when scientists found these preserved feathers in these fossils, they were able to look at what they're made out of microscopically, and they found that they were made out of the beta keratin protein instead of the fur protein. Now, beta keratin is a really hard protein, and it makes up the beaks, claws, and scales of birds, as well as reptiles. So the really cool thing about feathers is that they are more like scales than they are like fur or hair. They are really an incredibly modified scale, which is cool to think about. So fur. Going to talk about fur a little bit. On the other hand, mammal fur and our hair is made up of a very similar protein, but it's a little less rigid. It's a little more flexible. And it sounds similar, but it is alpha keratin. So we've got beta keratin making feathers and scales in dinosaurs, birds, and reptiles. And then we've got alpha keratin making hair and nails in mammals and us. Not to be confused with beta carotene, which is a nutritious pigment found in carrots. So a little bit different things going on. Not carotene, it's beta keratin and alpha keratin, not carotene. So we know a brief history of feathers. We know what they're made out of. Now let's go into the parts of feathers and feather anatomy. Luckily, feathers are pretty simple. So when we talk about the parts of a feather, there's only a couple to learn. They don't have a ton of pieces. But with that, they do have a lot of really neat pieces and parts that I didn't know about until recently. And so I do apologize that we are not doing this in person because this would be so much more fun to do with actual feathers in your face, in our hands, to touch and pass around. But we're going to do our best with PowerPoint and the pictures that we have. So the parts of a feather include, we've got this big kind of, I always think it feels like plastic. And if you've ever seen a quill pen or anything like that, that is that big piece at the bottom that is called the calamus, and it runs all the way up the up the feather until it gets thinner and is considered the rachis, and it is kind of the main shaft. Then we have the vein of the feather right here, which that part of the feather is what forms a very flat, smooth surface. And then within the vein, this is where feathers get really interesting, is where the feather comes off the rachis. So coming off the rachis are barbs, which we've got this right here. And then we've got barbules that come off of that, and then little hooklets. So the basic formation of that vein of the feather is kind of like a lattice. It's creating this very, very smooth, strong surface with all of those pieces forming that surface and linking together. So here's a more zoomed in photo of a feather. And even with your naked eye, you can kind of see where those barbs are. So here's our rachis right here, and then those barbs come off, and then there's barbules, and you can't really see the hooklets, but this is that smooth vein part, and you can see those barbs and barbules forming that. Now, this part of the feather where it's nice and smooth and flat is called the pennaceous region. And we'll talk some more about different parts of the feather too. And I'm sure if you've ever played with a feather before, you know that you can go in and kind of pull apart some of those, the vein part of the feather, and then it goes right back together. You can separate those barbs and then you can kind of put it back together. And that's those hooklets hooking together and apart and then back together again. And so I don't know, I know when I was little, like we would get feathers at our fair and we'd be walking around all day and we would totally mess them up. And then later that night, you can kind of just put them all back together. Now, this is a much more zoomed in picture of a feather, and this is showing those barbs and barbules, and you can just make out. So this is the barb, these are the barbules, and then you can just make out those little hooklets that hook these pieces together. So very simple anatomy, but a lot of little tiny things at play. So we know our feather anatomy basics. We know where they came from. We know what they're made of. We know that birds are dinosaurs. They're only on birds. So what are the different types of feathers? I know there's probably a type of feather that you're all familiar with. If you want to let me know what's a common type of feather that you probably use, especially this time of year in the winter, let me know in the chat. It is down feathers. That's correct. I'm sure we're all very familiar with down feathers. They are a really, really fluffy feather that are in our coats. They're in our pillows. These feathers are usually really, really close to a bird's body to help keep them warm. Their shape is different than the feathers we just looked at. You can see it still has the main rachis here going down the middle, and then just barbs coming off. The barbs aren't connected with the barbules or the hooklets, and that's on purpose. So all of this space in between all of these barbs creates air pockets, and that is incredibly good for insulating. I always like to say nature does nothing needlessly, and you can tell this is a very specialized feather. This is going to be near the bird's body. It's going to trap air and keep that bird very warm. And we also benefit from it. We use it to keep ourselves warm or keep our bodies nice and warm when we're out skiing or doing other winter sports. Down feathers are not pennaceous. They are plumulaceous, which is a very fun word to say. So the plumulaceous region is where they don't connect. The barbs don't connect to each other. So this is a plumulaceous feather. It's not a pennaceous feather. It doesn't have a pennaceous region. It just has those barbs that are just kind of all over the place. Down feathers we don't usually see because they are very close to a bird's body. Contour feathers, however, are feathers that we would see a lot. They definitely give a bird its characteristic coloration. And they're the main feathers that we're going to use and see to see the patterns and colors that help us ID. So contour feathers are both pennaceous and plumulaceous. So they are kind of a dual purpose feather. They've got this part of the feather on the top where it's nice and smooth and very connected. And then it's got this more wild and crazy part at the bottom, which would be closer to the body. So this part, this plumulaceous part of the feather is going to keep that bird nice and warm. And then we've got this pennaceous part of the feather that's going to help form a nice, smooth surface. So that's our dual purpose feather. Tail feathers are really important to birds too, especially because they have flight. And tail feathers need to be very strong. They're used for maneuvering, and they are usually symmetrical, mostly symmetrical. And this tail feather here is from a wild turkey. And if you look It only has a very, very tiny plumulaceous part of this feather. The rest of it is very smooth, very strong, very important for it to be that way so that it can help with flight and maneuverability. Now, the most important feathers, especially for, I guess I shouldn't say most important, they're all really important, but a really important feather for birds that have flight, because we know that not all birds have flight, even though they all have feathers. But flight feathers are very, very important, and they are typically asymmetrical. So, in comparison with that tail feather, you can see that this is asymmetrical. One side is a little bit smaller than the other side. And they also have somewhat of a curve. Now, if we were in person, I could show you a flight feather and you could see that it has a little bit of a curve. And that is all very, very important structure in order for birds to achieve lift. And as you can see, our flight feathers have no plumulaceous region. They are all pinnaceous. We want those feathers nice and smooth, all those barbs and barbules and hooklets all hooked together very, very closely to make sure that no air gets through so that these birds can achieve flight. Now, looking at a wing, you can see these flight feathers. And the flight feather that I showed you was probably from this part of the wing. And I'm not going to get into it during this program, but flight feathers, there are also different types of flight feathers in different regions of the wing. And you can kind of see a little bit of it in this picture, that some of these flight feathers, like down here, they're a little more symmetrical than some of these flight feathers here. But again, all of it works together to achieve lift, flight, and maneuverability for our flighted birds. So, what functions do feathers serve? Nature does nothing needlessly, and feathers serve many different types of very important functions for birds. One that we talked about a little bit, we talked about those downy feathers, is insulation. So this picture is a black-capped chickadee. They are not a common chickadee found in Nevada. We have more mountain chickadees, but they operate very similarly. This is a very common winter bird, even our mountain chickadees. And you can see this individual is all puffed up. They've got their feathers, it's got its feathers kind of puffed out a little bit. And you can tell because you can see and look at at how those feathers are kind of sticking out right here instead of lying flat on the body. And birds are able to control their feathers, and puffing them up is a really important way that they can get air into their own down feathers. So that bird has probably little tiny downy feathers near its body, and it puffs up those other feathers, and then those downy feathers can hold in all that air that they let in. But as we found in the other types of feather, everything about a feather also helps it insulate it from the elements. So having those contour feathers and having that nice, smooth, strong surface on those outer feathers too. Birds are very, very good at thermal regulating, and that's why we have birds in all parts of the world, even in both poles. I know people are always surprised that we find birds in the North Pole and the South Pole because feathers just don't seem as hefty to us as fur. But we got to remember that we're using both fur and feathers to keep ourselves warm. Those are both great options for being very, very well insulated. So birds are super, super great at thermal regulating, and it's because of the structure and the different functions of their feathers. We talked about flight feathers. Obviously, very essential for birds that are in flight and to maneuver in flight. And any guesses on what this bird is? This is one of our super, super fast birds, one of the fastest flying birds in the whole wide world. And part of that is because they've got those amazingly strong flight feathers, and they can maneuver those tail feathers too. But that is a peregrine falcon. So waterproof. The locking structures of feathers helps make them structurally waterproof. So I know that there's a lot out there about oils that keep birds waterproof, and those oils definitely help, but it's a tag team. Feathers are structurally waterproof. You can test it out with a feather yourself. If you put a drop of water on a feather, it will it will just beat up on it. Now, if you had a group of feathers and you took those feathers and you broke those barbules and hooklets apart, so you just had a really wonky looking feather, it would absorb more water. And that's one of the ways that oil spills affect birds, is that it makes it so that those barbs and those hooklets can't hook together, and then they can't protect themselves from water and they can't thermoregulate. So oil spills affect feathers first, and then basically those birds get hypothermia and they can't regulate their body temperature. Now, waterfowl do produce an oil that helps condition those feathers, and that helps with waterproofing as well. So it is a dual, a two-person job to remain waterproof. So camouflage is a huge reason why birds have feathers. It helps keep them super well hidden. This bird here is a Wilson's snipe. And I know some of you probably have heard about the wives' tale of snipe hunting. Well, snipes are real birds. But as you can see, they have really, really good camouflage. Those feathers are absolutely helping that bird stay very well hidden in its environment. And yes, snipe are real, and we have them here in Nevada. You could find one, but it might be a little difficult because they're hard to see. Communication is another really important function of feathers. They are used in a lot of different forms of communication with one another. So this is a male sage grouse. And any guesses on what this sage grouse is communicating? It's got its tail feathers all propped up. It's got its front feathers and those air sacs inflated. That means that this male sage grouse is single and ready to mingle. So he is communicating that he is ready to find a mate. These feathers that are used to attract mates are really pretty superficial. They don't serve much other purpose. They can also be used to communicate anger or aggression as well. A good example of that is any bird that has a crest on its head, like our Steller's jays, which I'm going to have a picture of in just a minute. Steller's jays have those big crests on their heads. They will move those feathers up and down, and that is communicating to other Steller's jays that they're either mad or they're scared or there's something going on. So there's a lot of different ways that they can use their feathers to communicate. Feathers used for communication are these superficial feathers. So they're usually brightly colored, or like our sage grouse, they have a very interesting shape that's very striking. They're usually pretty flashy. And we are going to go into more of these flashy, superficial feathers and how feathers get their color in just a minute. So superficial feathers, these are the ones that are used for communication. They're brightly colored, they're flashy, and wanted to show, so here is our Steller's jay that I was just talking about. So birds come in a wide variety of colors. It's one of the most amazing things about feathers and birds is all these different colors that we can see. And here's a difference in coloration. So we have a Western tanager here in this upper left corner. And then we've got a Steller's jay here and a Steller's jay here. Both of these are found in Nevada. They are some of the more colorful birds that we see here in Nevada. This top Western tanager up here with that firework coloration on its face is a male. And then down at the bottom, this one is also a Western tanager, and it is a female. So that is what we call sexual dimorphism, where they're sexually dimorphic because there is a difference in color between the male and the female feathers. And an example on the right here with these Steller's jays is we can't really tell. They're not sexually dimorphic. Not all birds are sexually dimorphic, and you can't really tell. They might both be males, they might both be females, or one might be the other. So you can't tell a difference. But looking at this Western tanager, the male is very colorful because he wants to attract that female. Now the female is muted, and it has more muted colors, and there's a lot of debate over that. Is that typically Western tanager males, or especially in songbirds, because sexual dimorphism is really common within songbirds, like our tanagers and other small songbirds like robins. I guess they're not really sexually dimorphic, but lots of sparrows and other small songbirds that we see, the males of those species aren't usually heavily involved in egg incubation, and that means that the female has to be sitting still on the nest for a lot longer time, which means that she is a lot more vulnerable to predation. And so it helps them to be more muted to blend in a little bit more. So that's one of the reasons they think. The Steller's jay, on the other hand, they are highly social. The males help with nest building, and sometimes they incubate. Steller's jays are also like very bold, aggressive birds. So it just kind of makes sense that they're all very, very brightly colored. So that's a little bit about sexual dimorphism. I could not do a presentation on feathers without sharing some birds that just have outrageous feather colors. Like, these birds are just amazing. I tried to keep most of the birds that I show you to be Nevada native because that's what we see in our backyard. But here's a little taste of some bird species that we would not find here. This one right here is a European bee eater, and just the turquoise, just amazing. The feathers on this bird are so beautiful. This bird is found in South Europe, East Asia, North Africa. It migrates to Central Africa, so probably not going to see it in Nevada anytime soon. This one here with that beautiful purple colored chest there is a lilac breasted roller. And this is also an African bird. And then, this one down at the corner with just amazing, I mean, even the beak is incredibly colored, is a malachite kingfisher, which is also from Africa. Feathers come in so many colors. It's really, really mind-blowing, and we're going to get into where those come from in just a minute, but I wanted to show a couple more. So these are the most superficially feathered birds of all. This one in this corner is the king of Saxony's bird of paradise, and this is also a bird of paradise. This is the magnificent bird of paradise, and their feathers, the only purpose, now I said nature does nothing needlessly, but like, this is just extra. These birds are just being totally extra. The only purpose these feathers serve is to attract mates. These crazy feathers on this head, this bird of paradise that's able to kind of fluff up the feathers. And if you've ever seen a video of them, they do like a silly dance, and then it's got these tail feathers curly cueing too. And then, of course, our most superficial of all is the male peacock. The size of their tails is just absurd. And the only purpose is to attract a female. It probably hurts them in some other regard, like flying, escaping predators, all of these other things. But nature has absolutely prioritized reproducing. So the proof is in the pudding there. And this last one here is a gray crowned crane, and they're one of my favorites, but they have these cute little afros. And both the males and the females actually have those. So not necessarily using their crown to attract a mate, but I'm sure a nice, full, healthy crown doesn't hurt. So we've seen a tiny sampling of what colors feather can come in. Now let's learn where these come from. For birds, there are only two ways that feathers get their color. It is either the physical structure of the feather or a pigment that is produced by the bird. And both of them are incredibly fascinating. So we'll start with pigment because it's a little more simple of it's a little more simple of a concept than structural color. Pigments are substances that are found in the cells of plants and animals that give them their color. And in bird feathers, there are three groups of pigments that are responsible for color. They are carotenoids, melanins, which you've probably heard of before, and porphyrins. So we'll start with the carotenoids. They work by absorbing every light wave in the spectrum except for the color that they reflect. And this is true with all pigments. And so the carotenoid pigment is responsible for bright yellows and yellowy orangey colors. So that means that they are absorbing all other color in the spectrum except for yellow and orange light waves. So the yellow and orange is what is getting reflected back to our eyes. And that is why we see those pigments in those colors. And so here's an example of those feathers and in some of those bright colors that the carotenoids would cause. The next one we're going to talk about is melanins. And we're probably very familiar with this because melanin is also what colors our skin and our hair. And as you could probably guess, melanin pigments produce a wide range of color, but they're the browns, the blacks, and pale yellows. So a lot of what we would probably call like nude colors. And melanin pigments are also in the skin of birds as well. It's not just the feathers. And they produce the blackest black. So melanins can produce super, super dark feathers. And then also everything in between, from black to browns to pale yellows. That's pretty much the spectrum. And you can see this is a barn owl, and these are all probably melanin pigment colored feathers here. Melanin in birds, though, is more than just coloration. It also makes feathers strong. And we learned about the structure of feathers and we learned about what feathers do. So it's really important for flight feathers to have melanin. And it is often, you can see this in all white birds, often they will have black wingtips or they'll have just all dark wings. Maybe they'll be another color and then they have all dark wings. A local example that we see in Nevada of an all white bird that has dark wings or dark wingtips is our American white pelicans. And that's because that melanin helps make that feather really, really strong. And not to get too dire about it, but that is bad news for birds that have no pigment, which we have a word for, and I feel like I'm about to blank on it. Not melanistic, not leucistic. It's albino. There we go. Albino birds are at a disadvantage because it means that their flight feathers are just not as strong. Albinism means a total lack of melanin. There is no melanin. Leucism or leucism, however you choose to say it, those birds will have a little bit of melanin. So a good way to tell the difference is if you see an animal that is all white but doesn't have pink or red eyes, that is probably that's a leucistic bird, not an albino bird. But if they are all white and they've got no pigment in their eyes, they're light or red or pink, then it's albino. So just another thing to think about when we're thinking about feather colors. The last pigment we're going to talk about is porphyrins, and these make pinks, browns, reds, and some greens, and they even fluoresce a bright red under UV light, which I'm not going to talk about too much, but birds can see in the UV spectrum. So it's kind of funny to talk about all these colors of birds because the way that these birds look to other birds is not the way that we see them. But those porphyrins have create these other bright colors. So we covered all the pigment colors, but we did not cover one color. And so we did pinks, reds, yellows, browns, greens, but we did not do blue. It's the blue family of colors. And that's where we're going to get into structural colors. There is no pigment that can create blue color. Blues and any color in that family, like blues and purples, they are not pigmented colors, but they're actually structural colors, which is so cool. Structural colors are produced by light refracting off of the molecular structure of the feather rather than pigments. So they operate a little bit differently, which is really, really cool. In addition to creating all of those blue and purple colors that we see in birds, structural colors also create iridescent. And iridescence is super common in a lot of birds, even some birds that we would call trash birds like European starlings have iridescence, but iridescent feathers, they're also structural and they work similar to a prism. That's how you're able to see all of these different colors in just one feather. So it depends on which angle you're seeing that feather, it might show a different color, which is very neat. I love all of that. So we've covered a ton of different topics about feathers. And I know a lot of you probably attended this program because maybe you collect feathers or maybe you make crafts with feathers. And so can you collect feathers? Feathers are very desirable. They come in all these beautiful colors. There's a lot of different cultural meaning to them. Can you go outside and just collect a feather? Well, unfortunately, the answer is no. The possession of feathers and other parts of native North American birds without a permit is prohibited by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. This protects wild birds by preventing their killing by collectors and the commercial trade in feathers. And it extends to all feathers, regardless of how they were obtained. There is no exception for molted feathers or those taken from road-killed feathers or road-killed birds or birds that run into your windows. Legally hunted birds, domestic birds, and there's a couple other exceptions exist. So birds that have a hunting season, you can have those feathers. Like obviously you can be in possession of a bird that you hunted. And then obviously if you are raising chickens or ducks or turkeys and those are domestic, you can have feathers from those birds as well. But it is a federal crime to collect wild feathers. And I couldn't do a program without saying that. So we're getting to the end of our program, and we are going to do a little review. So we're going to do a little true, false. So using that chat function, I want you to tell me if the next statement that comes up is true or false. So lots of animals have feathers. Is that true or false? We learned that at the very beginning. That was the first thing we learned. That is false. Only birds have feathers. Birds are dinosaurs. True or false? That is true. Birds are dinosaurs. They're avian dinosaurs, which is so cool. Dinosaurs had feathers. True or false? True. Some dinosaurs we have found have feathers, and some of them look like proto feathers or more like fur. That's where that dino fuzz comes in. Feathers have a system of barbs and hooks that create a weak, rough surface. That is false. That system of the barbs and the hooks creates a strong, smooth surface that helps with waterproofing and flying. We covered that. Good job. Feathers come in one size and shape. Yep, that is also false. They come in lots of different sizes and lots of different shapes. And we only hit the tip of the iceberg on some of the shapes that feathers come in. There are all sorts of different types of feathers that come in very, very interesting shapes. Like some birds have modified feathers that look like eyelashes, which is pretty cool. Feathers help birds fly, stay warm, camouflage, and communicate. That is true. We know that they help them do all those things and probably a couple more things too. Feather color is either from a pigment, structural color, or from paint, which we know that's a silly one. That is false. Feather color is either a pigment or it comes from the structure of the feather. There's like only two ways that feathers are going to get color. It's illegal to collect feathers. And we just covered that. That is also true. It is illegal to collect feathers when out in the wild. So that is the end of our program. I'm going to take questions from Jess if there was anything in the chat. If you enjoyed this even remotely, I highly recommend listening to the plumology episode of Ologies with Allie Ward. There is an ornithologist on there that specializes in researching feather color. And it's an amazing podcast. There might be a couple swears in there. So if you go to her website, the Ologies with Allie Ward, she also has bleeped episodes just in case. The Cornell Lab of Ornithology also has a super, super cool module to learn about feathers. It's called All About Feathers, and you can click through all of these different slides and learn so much about feathers. The Feather Atlas, that is a great place to go if you find a feather. You can go to the Feather Atlas and try and figure out where that animal came from. Now, obviously, if you take the feather into your house, please bring it back outside because it is illegal to collect. But the Feather Atlas, or even better, you can take a picture of it. But the Feather Atlas is a really, really cool resource. And then I've also got my email in here if you have any other questions for me. I'm free to answer. I can also send you any of these resources if you want links. And Jess is saying there's one question. Do you want to pull yourself out off mute?
Hello, everybody. The one question that we weren't able to answer by typing, we had some great questions from everyone. Thank you so much, is from Anne. And the question is, in relation to Michael's question, do non-albino white birds have melanin to strengthen their feathers?
That is a great question, and I don't know because, this is the second time I've done this program because there are birds that are completely white and are not albino, like great egrets. That's a really common bird here in Nevada, and they don't have any black. And I have not looked it up, so that is a great question.
All right, and one more. It says, why do feathers sometimes separate in water?
So if they're separating in water, it's probably a down feather because it's
All
not
right.
going to have the hooks and the hooklets or the barbules to hook it together.
All right, and a couple more flowing in. One is from Luis. Is there a great feather app that you recommend?
I haven't found one. The Feather Atlas is the closest thing to an app that I found. You might be able to get away with using iNaturalist, which is a great app. If you see a picture of a feather, you might be able to post that, and it's crowdsourced, so someone might be able to give you an answer within the app. But the Feather Atlas is what I recommend if you are looking to identify what bird a feather came from.
Okay, great. And I do want to say that the Feather Atlas link was provided to everyone in the chat, which is great. So you can just click on that. There is a question from Lori that says, does blood flow throughout the entire feather or just the tip of the feather?
It is just the part of the feather it's just kind of the bottom, kind of like our hair. It's just that part. And I know this because I used to be a zookeeper and we had to clip the wings of our turkeys. And it's kind of like when you are clipping your dog's nails. There's a dead part and there's an alive part. And if you clip the alive part, you're going to have a lot of blood. But if you hit the dead part, you're all good. And that's similar to how feathers are. So there is a threshold, there is like a quick to a feather on how far the blood comes out, goes up, up the rachis, up the shaft of the feather. But it's not all the way to the end.
Okay, and it looks like we have one more question from an 11-year-old, which is wonderful. The question is, how did feathers get their name? All the different types of feathers.
I have no idea. That's a really good question. I'm
I
sure,
know.
man, I don't know. I need to look that up. Like, how did we even come up with the word feather? That's such a cool word.
Yeah, that's a really deep question.
Yes. Obviously,
We
flight
also
feathers and
got
tail feathers are pretty easy, but like down feather, I don't know.
We also got a lot of thank yous to you and how wonderful the pictures were and how entertaining this was for all the participants. So a lot of thank yous to everyone.
Wonderful. And that brings me to one of my last slides is that after you leave this, there will be a survey. Please fill it out. Give us some ideas on programs for us to do for you. And last but not least, please get outside even though it's winter. There's lots of fun stuff to do, but just make sure that you are recreating responsibly in every sense of the word, COVID wise, litter wise. Pack it in, pack it out, stay safe, and have fun recreating. And there's one more chat here I'm going to check before I sign off. Oh, thank you. I hope you all had fun. And again, this was recorded and it will be up on our YouTube in a couple weeks. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us tonight. I had a great time. I hope you learned more about feathers. I hope you are encouraged to go learn even more about feathers. I have a couple things I need to Google after this. So I hope you do too. Have a good night, everyone.